Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Ryan Holiday with us again. Ryan, thanks for coming back on the program.
Yeah, I think this is like my third time. It's good to be back.
I think so. I think you're the winner now. You have more appearances on Growth Hacker TV than anyone.
I would not have expected that, but okay, I'll take it.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Well, you're a longtime friend of the show mainly because you wrote two books around marketing. You wrote Growth Hacker Marketing, and you wrote Trust Me, I'm Lying. And I'm a huge fan of both those books, and I think they're must-reads for this audience. But here's what's interesting. Your last book, The Obstacle is the Way, is not a marketing book. It's not a startup book. It's not an entrepreneurship book. But I think it might even be more important to our audience because it deals with things that are even more fundamental to entrepreneurship than marketing is. And so I really just want to get into your new book, The Obstacle is the Way, and I think the audience is just going to love this interview. Sound good to you?
Sounds great.
All right, so the obstacle is the way. As entrepreneurs, we hear the word obstacle, and we're familiar with that. that is the life of an entrepreneur. So tell us at a high level, what does the title mean? The obstacle is the way.
Yeah, so it's actually based on two things. So there's a line in Stoic philosophy from the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and he says, the impediment to action advances action, what stands in the way becomes the way. And really what he's saying that in Stoicism, the idea is you don't control the outside world, you control how you respond to it, right? So you don't control that there is an obstacle, but you control that you're going to respond and you're going to make the most of this given scenario that you're in. And then on the other side of things, there's a Zen saying the obstacle is the path, which essentially means whatever is blocking your path is creating a new path that you might not have originally intended. And so it's this sort of fusing of East and West. And the idea to me, like what the obstacle is the way means to me, is that when something happens, usually like a bad thing, right? When something bad happens that you might not have wanted to happen, what it is offering you is an opportunity to do something else, something that you wouldn't have intended, but it's still an opportunity for excellence in one form or another, right? It's like at the simplest level, you're stuck in traffic, you can get frustrated, or you can say, okay, now I have a couple minutes to think or to make a phone call or whatever, right? That would be like the most practical level. And then the other, it's like, you're dealing with some sort of extreme form of adversity and you're saying, this is going to toughen me up. I'm going to persevere through this. I'm going to come out the other side a stronger person. So it's just this idea that you can see the bad things that happen to you in your life as bad, or you can see them as opportunities. And one is a much more entrepreneurial approach.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's almost like you're changing our relationship to obstacles. By default, we think obstacle, that's a bad thing. Let's get bummed out when they happen. Let's get rid of them if we can. You're saying you actually don't control most of the obstacles in your life. It's not like you can will them away just because you don't want them to be there. So let's find a new relationship to it that's positive and actually helps us.
Yeah, and look, this is not my idea. This is what Stoic philosophy is about. It's this idea that we are both much less powerful than we think we are in terms of, our ability to control the world. But then ultimately we have this great power in that we always have the ability to adapt and improvise and persevere. And so what I've always taken from Stoic philosophy is that idea. It's like, instead of being this person that's trying to remake the world in your image, how can you be so adaptable and flexible that there really isn't anything that can happen to you that wouldn't advance your interests in one form or another?
Absolutely. I was just listening to Bruce Lee the other night. He said, be like water. And he was just like, the water becomes the container. It becomes the vessel that it's in. It takes advantage of the constraints and still is itself.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's a lot of overlap between Eastern and Western philosophy in that sense. And so I think, to me, it means that they're both honing in on some sort of central truth.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So what are some of the memorable examples in the book where you give an example of like, look, here's an obvious obstacle, and here's how it was dealt with in a way that is unique or inspiring or kind of off the wall, whatever?
Yeah, so the book is about Marcus Aurelius. He's obviously the most powerful man in the world at that time. He's the emperor of Rome. And he sort of come up with this formula, which is from Stoicism, and then I illustrate that with ideas from other people who may or may not have actually been Stoic, but are embodying Stoic ideas. So,
sure.
I tell the story of Johnny Rockefeller. He as a young man, he dealt with one of the worst financial crises of in American history, the Panic of 1857, and he sort of saw it as this apprenticeship, right? He's seeing it as a chance to learn about the market at its worst, and he later he says, like, this difficult period was my apprenticeship in the markets, basically. And so, I love that idea because, you and I were about the same age. We graduated not only into the sort of the first financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and then now the market's starting to look a little rocky. How are startups doing? Are startups having to raise down rounds? And so your first impulse could be, this is terrible. This is the worst thing that happened. I'm totally screwed. I'm going to lose everything. But what does that accomplish? Very, very little, right? Or if you can do what the Stoics do, which is to say, sort of control your perceptions to see things objectively. In fact, we know entrepreneurs tend to make tons of money when the markets turn, because this is when all the lightweights leave. This is when people who don't control their perceptions, people who are sort of either irrationally exuberant or irrationally bearish, this is when they get screwed. And if you can see these sort of fluctuations as temporary, which they often are, if you can not make them worse by overreacting, if you can say, hey, this is what the market needed to maintain its healthiness. This is sort of like a temporary forest fire, and all these things. This is how you end up not only strengthening yourself, but strengthening your own position, and potentially emerging from it stronger than you were before. So it's sort of stories like that. I talk about Thomas Edison, I talk about Theodore Roosevelt, Amelia Earhart, Ulysses S. Grant. I'm illustrating it with stories, but basically it's just this idea that most of the great men and women from history have responded to obstacles this way, and if they hadn't, we probably wouldn't have heard of them.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I love the idea that entrepreneurs, when it comes to the obstacles are a filter. And that if you can get through them and you can find yourself on the other side of those obstacles, then that means you belong. And if you can't find a way through, it's not that life was harder for you, it's that you're not a real entrepreneur.
Sure, and look, I think about this too. It's like, if writing a book was easy, or if books were automatically successful, then a lot more people would do it, and it wouldn't be as lucrative or as rewarding as it ultimately is. And so it's like scarcity is what creates value, right? And difficulty is what creates scarcity. And so I think that's a good way to see it, is that this is, when you're going through something tough, you can see it as a winnowing out. Like Marcus Aurelius, he has this line, I don't remember exactly, but he's saying, you can say, this is unfortunate that this has happened, or you can say, it's fortunate that this has happened to me because I'm able to deal with it. And, you got to choose which person you want to be.
And that's a radically different way to perceive the world. I mean, this isn't like a little off from normal. This is like radically different than the normal Joe out there sitting home, zoning out, watching cable every night. Like, this is why the winners think this way, because it's extremely rare.
Sure, it's extremely rare. What I say in the book too is these are very simple ideas, but that doesn't mean they're easy, right? So this is the idea of seeing a situation that everyone else sees as negative as a positive, is very simple, but incredibly difficult to do in practice. And it's not like, oh, hey, I read this book or I read this quote and now everything's different. You work for it and you fail at it probably more times than you succeed at it, but it's there for you when you need it absolutely the most. When you are doubting yourself and everything around you, that's where these ideas have the most power.
So let me ask you this. And, I think about my own life, and I feel like I'm very stoic in this regard. Like, I see obstacles as a filter, and I may not put it in the eloquent language that you do, but deep inside, I feel this way about the hardships of life. But I also feel like, I don't know if I could have read a book and learned these things. I almost feel like it's my childhood, it's the difficulties I've been through already, it's a part of my DNA. Do you think people can actually grow in the way they perceive the world, or is it just kind of stuck with who you are?
I mean, look, I don't think anyone's magically born with this power. I just don't think that makes sense. There's this great line from Plutarch where he's saying, do you learn do you get your experiences from books, or do you understand your experiences through books, right? So you get your knowledge from your life experiences, but it's reading and learning that helps you synthesize what those things are and come to an understanding about them. So, again, you can understand this stuff in theory, but unless you've actually been in a situation as an entrepreneur where everything went to shit, or you've been in a situation as a person where, you saw the cruel hand of Murphy's Law making everything that could go wrong, it doesn't, you don't totally get it, but over time, I think, not only over time do I think, anyone can come to understand this, but I think the longer you do this, the longer you're engaged in some venture where your success or failure depends on you and your attitude, the easier it gets over time. So
yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think about like a rubber band. Like, it doesn't stretch much at first, but if you keep stretching it to the limits grow as you stretch it. And so I think people are the same way. If they got a late start in life by pushing the boundaries of what they can do, they're not stretched as far, but they could be if they start embracing the obstacles.
Yeah, and look, I think that's one of the things I've thought about too. Like, whenever you're going through some like sort of tough thing, I like to think it's like, okay, I'd rather be going through it right now than to have had an easy time, because like here, I think it's inevitable that things will go wrong, right? So I would rather experience as much that could go wrong now when I can do something about it than to, there's this saying, storms make better sailors. The last thing you would want is to get hit with a hurricane, for the first time when you're the most unprepared for it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So, like, in some ways, resiliency is built through the adversity that you go through in life. And the more you have, the earlier you have, the better prepared you're going to be for that potentially catastrophic thing down the road.
Yeah, the title's not just a clever title. The obstacle really is the way. Like, the obstacle itself is the thing that makes you better.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, that's totally it. And I think it's one of those things where it can sound a little trite the first time you hear it, but then the more you say it and the more you think about it, I think the truer it becomes.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. So in this book, you break it into 3 sections: perception, action, and will. And I want everyone to go read this book, so we're not going to give them a Cliff Notes synopsis of it right now. But just at like a high level, walk us through perception, action, and will as kind of the 3 components of understanding the obstacle is the way.
Yeah, so perception, action, and will, these are 3 disciplines of Stoicism. They're not like the only disciplines, but I think they're the most important. So the discipline of perception, that's how you see whatever you're dealing with, right? And when most of us deal with difficult things, we make it worse, right, with how we see it. We're like, this is totally unfair, I'm completely screwed, it's over, how could this happen to me, this never happens, right? The stories we tell ourselves about a thing make it tougher than it actually needs to be, right? What the Stoics say is, events are objective, but our judgments about them are subjective. They say there is no good or bad, there's only perception. And so you might as well control those perceptions in such a way that you can see the events as they objectively are, rather than what other people say they are, whatever your fears or emotions might say they are.
And I love you just said the story we tell ourselves about the events. Because all day long, we're walking around with a story in our head about the objective events, but the story is very subjective about how we view those events, like you just said. And I think that's one of the things I've learned. If I can tell myself the right story, I'll win. If I tell myself the wrong story, I'll lose.
Sure. It's like, just think about a good example is like you quitting your job or you getting fired or laid off from your job. Objectively, it's the same thing. You don't work there anymore.
Exactly.
Right? But those are, one is an empowering narrative and one is a disempowering narrative. And obviously, I'm not saying you just make your own reality, but the story you tell yourself about an objective event determines its role in your life.
And there's more flexibility in the story than people realize. Like, it's not that we're saying A is B and black is white, but we are saying, look, there's a range of perception options. Let me choose one that benefits me.
Yeah, exactly. And then that leads into action, right? Stoicism is not the secret. It's not magically wishing things to be what other than what they are. But it's now that you have this objective interpretation. Okay, what are you going to do about it, right? Mm-hmm. Are you going to act on this thing with persistence? Are you going to do the right thing, even though that might be harder than doing the wrong thing? Are you going to get stuck in, the way things are supposed to be done? Or are you going to be able to be pragmatic and creative about that thing? So actions are what you do about it, right? Like I tell the story of Eisenhower in the book. He's able to sort of understand the fear-based components of the Blitzkrieg attack and sort of see an opportunity inside of it. Mm-hmm. But then he ultimately has to win that battle. So he's able to see it differently, come up with a strategy, but then he has to execute on that strategy mm-hmm. ultimately, or the perception doesn't matter. And then the final part that we bring to bear on these is the will. And the Stoic definition of will is not the same as willpower, although they're somewhat similar. The Stoics are a big part of Stoicism is accepting the things you can't change, right? And so one of those is just the role that you see adversity playing in your life. Like if you're like, hey, life is going to be hard. It's not going to be how I want it to be all the time, but I'm tough enough and I'm prepared for that. That's obviously going to make a lot of this easier. And then I think my favorite idea of the will is this concept of amor fati, which is sort of a love of what happens. That's what it loosely translates for, a love of fate. And it's this idea of when you face challenges or you face difficulties, like all your work gets erased, how are you going to see that afterwards? Are you going to see this as, the universe picking on you, or are you going to see this as, something that you're able to overcome? Do you have that sort of indomitable will to persevere? Like, I see persistence as an action and perseverance as a matter of will. And perseverance is ultimately the skill that matters most. Yeah,
and I mean, you put these three together, perception, action, and will, and it's so easy to see how empowering they are. It's so easy to see how these successful men and women have embodied these things, whether they call themselves Stoic or not, because obviously these are the things successful people do.
Right. I mean, it would be hard to come up with a successful person not thinking about these things.
Yeah.
That weren't, obviously there are sort of luck, right? Right place, right time. But that is not a particularly stable form of success.
And it's not repeatable. I can't learn from it. I can't learn from luck.
Right, exactly. So when you're talking about consciously sort of trying to deal with things, I think this is the way to think about it.
Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things about this book, because I've been kind of following it since it came out, is it's become the unofficial Bible of the NFL. You see, whole teams.
Certainly.
Yeah, here's this guy on Growth Hacker TV writing marketing books, and then he comes out with a book that the NFL is can't get enough of. What happened there? How does that happen?
So I don't know how it happens totally, but you write for one audience. I think what's interesting is you try to nail an audience that you're close with, and sometimes you don't realize that those same truths work for other audiences. Like my mentor Robert Greene, he wrote this book about power, which is sort of a nerdy historical take on the art of war and all these other books. And then all of a sudden it's huge in hip hop, and that's never what he could have predicted. But it's sometimes you can speak to an audience that you weren't necessarily intending to speak to. And I think what I was trying to take, I think business books are always so tactical about business. I was trying to take some more timeless principles and apply them to business. And it turns out that those timeless principles actually apply really well to the world of athletics. And what happened was, I was featured on some blog, and one NFL coach read the book, and then he liked it, and he passed it to other coaches, and then players, and then it was just this thing. And now obviously once you start to see something like that going, the role of a marketer or an entrepreneur is to obviously pour as much fuel on that fire as possible, and it's really taken off. But ultimately, last year, both the Seahawks and the Patriots read the book, the two teams in the Super Bowl, which was not at all what I expected when I sold my business publisher a book about ancient philosophy, but I'll certainly take it. It's been
That's
very
awesome.
Cool.
And this is something we talked about before we started recording, but I said I want to talk about it at the end of the interview because there's something here. this has been your most successful book.
Yeah.
But you've had the least control of this book in terms of marketing. It's taken on a life of its own. It's found its way into niches and verticals like the NFL that you didn't really plan for with your, press releases. And yet, it's the most successful. What is the takeaway there? As a marketer, that's got to make us uneasy.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, I don't want to give myself. You can often tell yourself a story about something after the fact. But when I was marketing and writing this thing, I knew that I wanted to set it up for long-term word-of-mouth success more than anything else. Because ultimately, books that are successful are perennially successful. Like this book missed the New York Times list, even though it probably sold enough copies. But it missed that copy. It missed the list the first week. And I was very disappointed, but I remember reminding myself, hey, when I was marketing this thing, I wasn't marketing to have 1 week of success. I wanted to have a year or 2 years or 10 years of success. And so ultimately what I think happens is, you have an idea of the niche that you want to hit and you do your best to hit it. And when you come close to it, that's what most successful projects come close to hitting that product market fit. And then every once in a while, you really nail it, and the difference between kind of nailing it and really nailing it are enormous. To the degree of really nailing it means it sort of takes care of itself, and kind of nailing it means, like, I don't know, it's like a car with 3 functioning wheels and 1 kind of squeaky messed up wheel versus great wheels and it's like on a downhill slope. Like one just takes care of it and the other one you can get going, but you really, really have to work on it.
Yeah. And so can we sum this up in saying product matters? And if you nail product, it opens up doors you couldn't have marketed yourself into.
I think that's totally right. And I think what I take from it so one of the things I remember telling myself when I was writing the book is, I'm going to write the absolute best book that I can, and then you understand at a certain point that the book leaves your hands and it enters the world, and you don't control that part of things, right? Like, all you can do is put in the effort, and then it leaves your hands. And so, like, let's say we've been sitting here talking, and the book had sold 1/3 of as many copies. I still would have seen it as a success because I did everything that I had tried to do. Like, I know this was the best that I could do. Now, sometimes it leaves your hands and it's much more successful than you want it to be. I think one of the Stoic things you take away from that is like, hey, this has less to do with you and more to do with external events that are, outside of your control. So I think because I'm working on my next book, which comes out in June, and one of the things I'm really working on is, like, you cannot tell yourself that just because you nailed the product one time, you are guaranteed or in any way entitled to nail a product the second time. Yeah. And that you have to win an audience from scratch every single time.
It's kind of like the perception piece. It cuts both ways. You perceive the obstacles as things you can't control, but you have to also perceive the successes as things that weren't completely engineered by you, even though, of course, you're a factor in them. It cuts both ways.
Yeah, look, the most prominent Stoic is Marcus Aurelius. He's the emperor of the known world. And then the other is Epictetus, who was a former slave who had actually been banished from Rome by a different emperor. And they were only about 1 generation apart. They kind of overlap slightly. But to me, what I take from that is it's a philosophy oriented for extreme adversity on the one hand, but extreme success on the other. Like, you have to be objective about obstacles and failures, but you also have to be objective about your lucky breaks. Like, so one of the things that happened for this book really early on is it came out, it did okay, and then we did this promotion with Amazon where it was with BookBub and Amazon where we discounted the book for like 1 week. We took it from $9.99 as an ebook to $3.99. And it sold really well that week because, when you take a price down to 1/3, it's going to sell better. And then I don't remember if it was like Amazon's algorithm or if it was a conscious decision there, but Amazon agreed to keep the price there but pay the full royalty anyway. So it was like a total fluke. Basically, the book's price was subsidized at a discounted rate for nearly a year. And that was a lucky break that was outside my control. I took advantage of it, but it was a lucky break. So I have to be very conscious of the fact that might not have happened, and my book might not have been successful had that not happened. And so I can't take the success of the book and have it say anything about me, because it says more about external random events than it does about me. Obviously, it was my decision to do the discounting, and I put myself in a position to be successful, but you want to make sure that you don't let success or failure say something about you as a person.
Yeah, and the old quote, the harder I work, the luckier I get. It seems like people who consistently put out high quality stuff and consistently try new things end up getting luckier more than the general population. And so even though they don't control it, they're living the kind of life that leads to these things happening. Like, you weren't sitting around eating cheesy poofs. You were creating deals with Amazon and writing books and marketing yourself, and then this awesome windfall happened. So I think there's something there. It's like, you don't control it, but you're a part of it.
Yeah, and I think if you have that attitude, then on your future things, you don't feel that you're entitled to that, or that it's yours by right or guarantee. So you like, I know for the new book, I'm gonna have to come up with whatever that next thing is, and like, I also don't take for granted, like, hey, this next book's gonna magically make its way through professional sports. I have to say, okay, why did it happen last time? What can I do that could potentially make that likely to happen again? And how can I, as I'm writing, how can I be conscious of that? You want to, what is that saying? Like, fortune favors the prepared. Like, you want to put yourself in a position to succeed, but then also, not live or die by that success either.
I think it's a really good way to put it. Now, you end the book with the chapter called "Prepare to Start Again." It seems like this whole thing's getting circular. What do you mean by that?
Well, it is circular. I see perception, action, and will being a loop, right? So you perceive something, you take action on it, you bring to bear what you can on it, and then what happens? Then you either succeed or fail, and you have to start again, or something outside your control happens, or you get a verdict on that process, and then it starts again. John Boyd has the concept of an OODA loop. I think it's partly like that. There's this Haitian saying I have in that chapter. It was called, like, behind mountains there are more mountains. Like, you get to a mountaintop, you're not like, and this is it, I'm done. That's when you realize, like, oh wait, behind this mountain was something that I didn't even see or think about. Success comes with its own obstacles. Failure comes with its own obstacles. You've got there. You don't magically enter the promised land and then everything is awesome. Like, if we were to find, like, if we were to poll some of the most successful people in the world right now, I bet their lives would be more difficult than our lives would be, right? Like, the responsibilities and burdens that come with power and success.
More money, more problems.
Never really end. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about the circular thing you're talking about. It's like, in lean startups, we have build, measure, learn. And then you don't stop. Sure. You build more, you measure more, you learn more, and it's circular. Totally. Perception, action, will is almost like a lean startup for the soul.
I mean, yeah, I would never say that, because that would seem super douchey if I was like, oh, I'm writing this book. It's
See, like, I'm allowed to say it though.
Right. But no, I think that's right. You're like, when you launch a company, that's like the first idea, and then what are you doing now? You're launching features for that product, which are just a microcosm of that same process, or
it's the fractal
representation of that same process again. And I think that it's like you're dealing with this idea of the obstacle as the way as your personal philosophy, and that's step one. And then it's like, okay, how do you apply it to technical difficulties when you're trying to launch something, to driving to work, towards getting ending a relationship, towards your a loved one passing away, whatever. You're always going to have the ability to apply this framework either at a micro or a macro level.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I'm so glad to have you on the show. This has been an incredible interview. I know people are going to eat this one up. A couple last questions for you, and these are the two that I end with now. They're just kind of fun, fluff questions. One is, what are you working on right after this interview is over? It could be like walking your dog. It could be something boring. It could be something awesome.
So I got a lunch meeting that I have to go to, and then I'm going to try to, I flew in from Finland last night, and so I'm like horribly behind on emails. So I'm going to try to bang out a bunch of emails so then after my lunch I can get back to some writing.
Nice. All right, and then number two, what is the best advice you have for any company that is trying to grow?
Well, if I was trying to think about it in the context of the discussion we just had in the book, it would say that it would just to reiterate the Stoic idea of like, look, you don't control what happens, you don't control the results, you only control what you put into that thing and how you respond to what happens. And if you can focus, so many people burn out so much of their energy focusing on things that are outside their control, that just narrowing that scope for you on to things that will exclusively bear effort, then you will be far more effective than most people, right? If you spend less time complaining or whining or trying to move immovable objects, you will be bringing more to the things that you do control than your average person who's spread out too thin.
Yeah, well, just to tell you how much I've enjoyed this interview, I'm going to do a pre-edit of it before it actually goes live on GHTV, and I'm going to send it to all the team members that I work with and say, hey, listen to this, awesome, because there's stuff here. Like, I want the people that I work with to, like, get what you're saying, because I feel like if they realize there's certain things they can't change, you can't just move mountains because you want to, but you can respond, you can perceive, you can act, you can have the will that allows you to make the most of all the difficulties that come along with a startup, then they're going to be so much more prepared. So hopefully I can get this out to them today so they can hear it as quick as possible.
Well, thank you, man. It's been really cool to watch you grow this show, and thanks for having me on again, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, have a good one, Ryan.
All right, see you, man.